In the autumn of 1405, more than 300 ships gathered in the mouth of the Yangtze River, their hulls towering 5 stories above the water, their holds packed with silks, porcelain, soldiers, diplomats, and enough rice to feed 27,000 men for 2 years. The largest wooden vessels ever built were about to cross the Indian Ocean, carrying the authority of the Ming Emperor to kingdoms most Chinese had only read about in outdated maps. Between 1405 and 1433, the Ming Dynasty launched 7 massive maritime expeditions that would dwarf anything Europe attempted for another century. These treasure fleets, commanded by a Muslim eunuch admiral named Zheng He, visited more than 30 kingdoms across Southeast Asia, India, the Persian Gulf, and the eastern coast of Africa. The ships themselves were engineering marvels, some reportedly stretching over 400 feet in length, fitted with watertight bulkheads, balanced rudders, and multiple masts carrying enormous cotton sails. The fleet carried officials fluent in Arabic, Persian, Tamil, and Malay. It transported Buddhist monks, Confucian scholars, military officers, common sailors from Fujian and Guangdong, and clerks responsible for recording every gift exchanged and every diplomatic encounter. What follows is not the story of exploration in the European sense, but something stranger and more specific, a portrait of how the early Ming state projected power, gathered intelligence, enforced hierarchy, and understood its place in a world it believed revolved around the emperor in Beijing. Zheng He himself was born Ming He around 1371 in Yunnan province, far from the ocean, in a family that traced its ancestry to Mongol settlers and Persian merchants. His father and grandfather were both Muslims who had made the pilgrimage to Mecca. When Ming armies conquered Yunnan in the 1380s, the boy was captured, castrated, and sent into imperial service. He served in the household of the Prince of Yan, who would later seize the throne in a bloody civil war and reign as the Yongle Emperor from 1402 to 1424. Eunuchs occupied a strange but powerful position in Ming politics. Barred from founding dynasties of their own, they could be trusted with authority that might tempt an ambitious general. Zheng He was literate, competent, loyal, and had proven himself in combat during the prince's rebellion. When the Yongle Emperor decided to build the largest fleet the world had ever seen, he chose Ming He to command it, bestowing the honorific surname Zheng. The admiral would spend the next 3 decades crossing the known world, returning tribute, settling disputes, suppressing pirates, and occasionally bringing foreign kings back to Nanjing in chains. The decision to build such a fleet was not inevitable. The early Ming state was not a maritime empire by inclination. The dynasty had been founded in 1368 by a former peasant and Buddhist novice who despised the Mongol Yuan dynasty and looked with suspicion on foreign trade. But the Yongle Emperor had taken the throne through violence, deposing his nephew, and he needed to prove that heaven favored his rule. Grand gestures helped. Building a new capital at Beijing helped. Sending envoys to every corner of the known world, bearing gifts and expecting submission, helped. The treasure fleet was as much a diplomatic tool as a military one, an instrument for turning distant kingdoms into participants in the tributary system that structured Chinese foreign relations. Under this system, foreign rulers sent embassies to Beijing, acknowledged the emperor's supremacy, and received titles, seals, and lavish gifts in return. The relationship was ritual and economic at once. Tribute missions were also trading expeditions, and Chinese silk and porcelain flowed outward while spices, gems, horses, and exotic animals flowed back. The treasure fleet made that system a reality across the Indian Ocean, projecting an image of Chinese wealth and order into regions that had never seen a Ming official. But such expeditions required infrastructure that had to be built from nothing. The ships were constructed at the Longjiang shipyard near Nanjing, a sprawling complex of dry docks, timber yards, rope walks, and foundries that employed thousands of workers. The largest vessels, known as treasure ships, supposedly measured over 400 feet long and 160 feet wide, dimensions that some modern scholars find implausible given the limits of wooden construction. Smaller grain ships, water tankers, and warships made up the rest of the fleet, each designed for specific roles. The work was staggering, Camphor wood and teak had to be sourced from the forests of Fujian, Guangdong, and even Southeast Asia. Iron fittings, sails woven from hemp and cotton, coils of rope thicker than a man's arm, anchors weighing thousands of pounds, all had to be produced, transported, and assembled. Many of the shipwrights were conscripts or hereditary laborers, whose families had built boats for generations. The scale of the operation reflected the ambitions of the emperor and the capacity of the early Ming state to mobilize resources across southern China. By 1405, the fleet was ready and the first voyage began. Life aboard these ships was a mixture of rigid hierarchy and forced intimacy. Senior officials occupied private cabins in the stern. Common sailors slept in communal berths below deck, stacked in tiers with barely enough room to turn over. Soldiers drilled on deck. Interpreters studied their languages. Clerks kept meticulous records of provisions, distances traveled, and diplomatic transactions. Food was stored in massive quantities: sacks of rice, barrels of salted fish, dried vegetables, soybeans sprouted on deck to prevent scurvy. Fresh water was hoarded in ceramic jars and replenished whenever the fleet reached a safe harbor. Doctors and herbalists treated injuries and illnesses with acupuncture, herbal remedies, and prayers to Tianfei, the goddess who protected sailors. Religious life aboard the ships reflected the diversity of the crew. Buddhist monks chanted sutras. Muslim sailors prayed facing Mecca. Offerings were made before departing port and after surviving storms. The voyages could last 2 years or more, and the psychological strain of months at sea, surrounded by the same faces and the endless creak of wood and canvas, was considerable. Discipline was enforced through flogging and, in extreme cases, execution. The fleet navigated using tools and knowledge accumulated over centuries. Chinese mariners had been using magnetic compasses since at least the 11th century, and by the Ming period, these compasses were divided into 24 directional points, each with its own name. Navigators consulted rutters, written guides that described coastlines, reefs, currents, and safe anchorages. Star charts helped fix latitude by measuring the angle of the pole star or the Southern Cross above the horizon. The most important factor, however, was the monsoon. The fleet departed China in winter, riding the northeast winds southward across the South China Sea. It continued west across the Indian Ocean during the spring, then waited in Indian or Arabian ports until the summer monsoon reversed direction, carrying the ships back home. This rhythm dictated the entire schedule of the voyages, and any delay could mean wintering in a foreign port or attempting a dangerous crossing against the wind. The world the treasure fleet encountered was already interconnected. Arab, Indian, Malay, and Chinese merchants had been trading across the Indian Ocean for centuries, carrying spices, textiles, gems, horses, and slaves. The Chinese were latecomers to this network, but they arrived with resources and authority no private merchant could match. At each port, the fleet performed the rituals of tributary diplomacy, presenting imperial letters, conferring titles on local rulers, exchanging gifts, and recording everything for the official histories. The goods carried outward were carefully chosen: porcelain from Jingdezhen, silk from Suzhou and Hangzhou, iron tools, lacquerware, and luxury items intended to impress. In return, the fleet brought back spices, incense, ivory, rhinoceros horn, precious woods, medicinal herbs, and animals that Chinese audiences found astonishing. Most famously, a giraffe presented to the Yongle Emperor in 1414, which was interpreted as a kiline, a mythical creature whose appearance signaled heaven's approval of the emperor's virtue. Now the shipyards were ready, the fleet assembled, and the monsoon winds turned favorable. The first voyage would carry the treasure fleet south through familiar waters and then beyond, into regions where the emperor's authority existed only as an idea, waiting to be made real through ritual, trade, and the sheer presence of ships no one had seen before. The decision to build the largest wooden ships in history was made in the winter of 1402, shortly after the Yongle Emperor seized the throne from his nephew. The new emperor had won power through violence and treachery, besieging Nanjing until the palace burned and the rightful heir disappeared into the flames. Legitimacy was not automatic for a man who had overthrown his own family. The Yongle emperor needed something grand, something that would demonstrate heaven's favor and project Ming authority beyond the borders where whispers of usurpation could not reach. He ordered the construction of a fleet that would dwarf any maritime force the world had ever seen, and he ordered it built quickly. The shipyards at Longjiang, just outside Nanjing on the northern bank of the Yangtze River, became the center of this effort. Longjiang was not a new site. Shipbuilding had taken place there for centuries, supplying grain transports and patrol vessels for the imperial canal system, but nothing in its history prepared it for what was demanded in 1403. The Yongle emperor wanted hundreds of ships, including treasure vessels that would measure over 400 feet in length, with 9 masts and hulls tall enough to tower above coastal fortifications. The dimensions sound implausible even now, and some historians remain skeptical, but the official records are consistent, and the ruins of the dry docks suggest that something enormous was indeed constructed there. The shipyard complex sprawled across several square miles. Dry docks were carved into the riverbank, each one lined with stone and fitted with wooden gates that could be closed to drain the water and allow work on the hulls. Separate yards were designated for different types of vessels. The treasure ships, called bachuan, were the flagships, designed for prestige and capacity rather than speed. Grain ships, or lianchuan, were broader and shallower, built to carry rice and other provisions. Water tankers held fresh water in enormous ceramic jars lashed below deck. Escort vessels, smaller and faster, were armed with cannons and crossbows to protect the fleet from pirates. Each type required different timbers, different techniques, and different specialists. The logistics of supplying the yards was staggering. The treasure ships alone required camphor wood and nanmu, both prized for their resistance to rot and their structural strength. Camphor came from the forests of Fujian and Jiangxi, where logging teams worked under military supervision, felling trees that had taken centuries to grow. Nanmu, even rarer, was sourced from the mountains of Sichuan and Guizhou, transported down rivers on rafts, and then overland by conscripted laborers. Teak, used for decking and fittings, was imported from Southeast Asia, arriving as tribute or through state-controlled trade. Iron for nails, brackets, and anchors came from foundries in Anhui and Jiangsu, where workers smelted ore in clay furnaces and hammered the metal into standardized fittings. Hempen rope, woven from fibers grown in the Yangtze Delta, was produced in workshops that employed hundreds of women and children. Sails were sewn from cotton cloth, each one requiring dozens of bolts of fabric stitched together and reinforced at the stress points. The scale of coordination required to bring all these materials to Longjiang at the right time and in the right quantities was itself a demonstration of state power. The workforce was drawn from across the empire. Carpenters formed the aristocracy of the yards, and many came from families that had built ships for generations. The trade was hereditary in some regions, with sons inheriting not just skills but also legal obligations to serve the state when called. Caulkers, who sealed the seams between planks with a mixture of lime, tung oil, and crushed oyster shells, worked in teams, their hands stained white and their lungs thick with dust. Sailmakers sat in open sheds, stitching in silence or singing work songs to keep rhythm. Rope makers twisted hemp fibers into cables thick enough to hold a mast in a typhoon. Many of these workers were conscripted, assigned to the yards as part of their tax obligation or as punishment for minor infractions. Others were hired laborers, paid in rice and copper coins, drawn to Nanjing by the promise of steady work in a period when floods and banditry had disrupted agriculture in the interior. The work was dangerous. Timber slipped from cranes and crushed men beneath it. Fires broke out in the workshops where oil and pitch were stored. Workers fell from scaffolding or were caught between the hull and the dock when a ship shifted unexpectedly. The pace was relentless. The emperor wanted the first fleet ready within 2 years, and overseers enforced the schedule with fines, floggings, and forced labor extensions. There was no room for the careful, methodical craftsmanship that had characterized earlier shipbuilding. Speed mattered more than perfection, and the result was a fleet built as much through coercion as through skill. The treasure ships themselves were feats of engineering. though their exact design remains a matter of scholarly debate. They were built with multiple internal bulkheads, watertight compartments that divided the hull into sections. If one compartment flooded, the others would remain dry, keeping the ship afloat. This technique was ancient in China, borrowed from the construction of bamboo rafts, but applying it to vessels of such size required immense precision. The rudders were balanced, mounted on a central post that allowed them to be raised or lowered, depending on the depth of the water. The masts were not fixed, but stepped into slots in the deck, so they could be removed or replaced if damaged. The sails were made of panels that could be reefed independently, giving the crew fine control over speed and direction. None of these features were inventions of the Yongle period. They were refinements of technologies developed over centuries of river and coastal navigation. What was new was the scale and the ambition. Not everyone believed the project was wise. Confucian officials at court viewed the treasure fleet with suspicion. They argued that the expense was unjustifiable, that the empire's resources should be directed toward agriculture, flood control, and defense of the northern frontier. They pointed out that the ships served no immediate military purpose, that the southern seas were already navigable by private merchants, and that the tributary gifts brought back from foreign kingdoms would never repay the cost of the voyages. Some criticized the entire venture as a eunuch's folly, noting that the project's chief advocates were men like Zheng He, castrated servants who owed their positions to personal loyalty rather than Confucian merit. These objections were noted, filed, and ignored. The Yongle emperor had made his decision, and the ships continued to rise along the riverbank. The political motivations behind the fleet were multiple and overlapping. Legitimacy was paramount. By launching expeditions to distant kingdoms and bringing back exotic tribute, the emperor could demonstrate that heaven approved of his rule, that foreign princes acknowledged his authority, and that the Ming Dynasty stood at the center of a hierarchical world order. The voyages also served economic purposes, though not in the way a modern observer might expect. The Ming state did not seek profit in the commercial sense. It sought control over trade, the ability to regulate the flow of goods, and to extract symbolic submission from those who wished to participate in the Chinese market. The treasure fleet was a tool of statecraft, not commerce. It was meant to awe, to intimidate, and to establish relationships that would channel trade through official, supervised channels rather than allowing it to develop independently beyond the emperor's reach. By 1405, the first wave of construction was complete. The dry docks stood empty, their stone walls scarred from the weight of the hulls. The timber yards were stripped bare. The workshops fell silent. Along the Yangtze, hundreds of ships lay at anchor, their hulls freshly painted, their sails furled, their holds filling with rice, porcelain, and bolts of silk. The shipwrights had done their work. The logistics officers had done theirs. The emperor had his fleet. Once the ships were built, crewed, and loaded, the question became who would command them, and what kind of men would fill the ranks below. The man chosen to command the largest fleet ever assembled was born far from the sea, in the landlocked hills of Yunnan province, sometime around 1371. His family name was Mo, a common surname among the Hui Muslims who had settled in Yunnan during the Mongol Yuan dynasty, and his given name was He. His father and grandfather had both made the pilgrimage to Mecca, a journey that conferred prestige and suggested means, and the household spoke Arabic as well as Chinese. The world Mo, he knew as a child, was one of mosques and markets, of trade routes threading through mountains toward Burma and Tibet, and of the lingering authority of Mongol princes who ruled Yunnan as a semi-independent realm, even after the Ming Dynasty claimed the rest of China. That world ended abruptly in 1381, when Ming armies under General Furi Juda swept into Yunnan to crush the last Mongol resistance. Mahi was perhaps 10 years old when he was captured. The details are sparse, but the outcome was final. He was castrated, a common fate for boys taken in war, and sent north into imperial service. Castration was not a medical procedure. It was a punishment and a means of control, carried out with a knife and boiling oil, and survival was uncertain. Those who lived became eunuchs, men whose altered bodies marked them as servants of the throne, unable to establish families or claim inheritance. and therefore, in theory, loyal only to the emperor. Ma He survived, and by his teenage years he had entered the household of Zhu Di, the Prince of Yan, who governed the northern frontier from his base in what would later become Beijing. Zhu Di was the fourth son of the Hongwu Emperor, founder of the Ming Dynasty, and he was ambitious, literate, and capable. His household included soldiers, scholars, and eunuchs, and Ma He distinguished himself among them. He learned to read classical Chinese, to keep accounts, to manage logistics, and to lead men in minor campaigns against Mongol raiders along the northern steppe. He was tall, reportedly over 6 feet, broad-shouldered, and possessed of a voice that carried authority. When Zhu Di rebelled against his nephew, the Jianwen Emperor, in 1399, launching a brutal civil war to claim the throne, Ma He fought at his side. The war lasted 4 years, ending in 1402 when Zhu Di seized Nanjing and declared himself the Yongle Emperor. The Jianwen Emperor vanished, likely killed, and the new regime began distributing rewards to those who had ensured its victory. Ma He received a new name, Zheng He, bestowed by the emperor himself. The character Zheng carried imperial favor and linked him symbolically to the throne. He was promoted to the rank of Grand Director, a senior eunuch position that carried administrative and military authority, and within 3 years the Yongle Emperor assigned him command of the treasure fleet. The choice was strategic. Zheng He had no family to prioritize over the emperor, no regional base to defend, and no prospect of using the fleet to launch a coup. His literacy and logistical experience made him capable of managing the complex bureaucracy required to supply and coordinate hundreds of ships and tens of thousands of men. His Muslim faith and knowledge of Arabic gave him an advantage in negotiating with the Islamic sultanates of Southeast Asia and the Indian Ocean world, and his personal loyalty to the Yongle Emperor, forged in the fires of civil war, made him the ideal servant for a mission that was as much about demonstrating imperial power as it was about trade or exploration. The fleet Zheng He commanded was not a single entity but a floating hierarchy, mirroring the rigid social order of Ming China. At the top sat Zheng He himself, bearing the title of Grand Eunuch and Envoy Plenipotentiary, empowered to speak in the emperor's name and to bestow titles and gifts on foreign rulers. Below him were vice-admirals and assistant envoys, also eunuchs, who managed different squadrons or administrative functions. The fleet divided into smaller task groups, each with its own commander, and within those groups individual ships answered to captains who might be military officers, experienced sailors promoted from the ranks, or occasionally civilian officials assigned for their literacy and record-keeping skills. The military contingent included battalion commanders responsible for the thousands of soldiers aboard, men trained in crossbow, sword, and the early firearms that were beginning to reshape Chinese warfare. The sailors themselves came largely from the coastal provinces of Fujian and Guangdong, regions with centuries of maritime tradition. Fujianese sailors were renowned for their skill in handling large junks and reading the moods of the sea, while Cantonese navigators brought knowledge of the trade routes south toward the islands of Southeast Asia. Many of these men inherited their positions. Maritime families in port towns like Quanzhou and Guangzhou had supplied sailors to imperial fleets for generations, and a son often followed his father onto the water. They worked the lines, adjusted the sails, hauled cargo, and maintained the ships, their labor essential but their status low. They slept in communal berths below deck, ate plainly, and received wages that were modest but regular, a rare stability in a world where most peasants lived season to season. Above the sailors but below the officers sat a diverse array of specialists whose skills made the voyages possible. Interpreters were critical, many of them Muslims like Zheng He, who spoke Arabic, Persian, and the coastal trade languages of the Indian Ocean. Men like Ma Huan, a scholar who sailed on several voyages and later wrote an account of the lands visited, served as translators and cultural mediators, smoothing negotiations and recording tributary exchanges. Buddhist monks traveled with the fleet as well, offering prayers for safe passage and performing rituals to honor Tianfei, the goddess of sailors, whose protection was invoked before every departure. Clerks and scribes kept meticulous records of supplies, expenditures, gifts given and received, and the names of foreign rulers met along the way. These records, written on paper and silk, were meant to be compiled into official histories once the fleet returned, though many were later destroyed or lost. The privileges of rank were visible in every detail of shipboard life. Senior officials occupied private cabins in the stern castle of the treasure ships, spaces furnished with wooden furniture, oil lamps, and enough room to conduct meetings or review documents. They ate separately, their meals prepared by dedicated cooks and featuring rice, meat, vegetables, and occasionally fresh fish purchased at ports. Junior officers shared smaller quarters, while ordinary sailors and soldiers slept in hammocks or on mats in the lower decks, spaces that grew stifling in tropical heat and damp in monsoon storms. Food for the lower ranks was communal and simple: rice, salted fish, dried vegetables, and occasional rations of soybeans that could be sprouted to provide fresh greens and stave off scurvy. Water was rationed carefully, stored in massive ceramic jars that lined the holds, and supplemented whenever the fleet anchored near a reliable source. Discipline was strict and punishment swift. Regulations governed almost every aspect of behavior, from the handling of cargo to conduct during shore leave. Theft, insubordination, and violence among crew members were punished with flogging, confinement, or in extreme cases execution. Officers held the authority to impose penalties on the spot, and the records suggest they used it. The fleet could not afford disorder. 27,000 men confined to wooden ships for months required constant management, and any breakdown in hierarchy risked chaos. At the same time, the command structure allowed for a degree of flexibility. Experienced sailors could earn promotions, skilled interpreters gained the ear of senior officials, and men who proved themselves in combat or negotiation might receive commendations and rewards upon return to Nanjing. The diversity of the fleet reflected the complexity of Ming society and the reach of its ambitions. Han Chinese formed the majority, but the ranks included Hui Muslims, Mongolian soldiers, and men from the southern frontiers who spoke languages other than Mandarin. This mix was not accidental. The Yongle Emperor understood that the fleet would encounter Islamic sultanates, Hindu kingdoms, Buddhist monarchies, and trading cities where no single language or religion dominated. Zheng He's own background as a Muslim gave him credibility in ports like Malacca and Calicut, while the presence of Buddhist monks reassured Chinese sailors and affirmed the spiritual protection of the voyage. The fleet was in a sense a microcosm of the empire itself, hierarchical, multi-ethnic, bound together by loyalty to the throne and the promise of reward for service. Yet for all its scale and sophistication, the fleet depended ultimately on the competence and will of the men who sailed it. Zheng He's reputation grew with each successful voyage, and by the time of the later expeditions he was recognized across the Indian Ocean as the representative of the most powerful empire in the world. His ability to command respect, to navigate the politics of the court in Nanjing as skillfully as the waters of the open sea, made the voyages possible. When he stood on the deck of a treasure ship, watching the coast of China recede into the distance, he carried with him not just the authority of the emperor but the labor and loyalty of thousands of men whose names history has mostly forgotten. With the fleet assembled and command assigned, the ships weighed anchor and began the long journey south, navigating rivers, coastlines, and open sea using tools and knowledge accumulated over centuries. A fleet of 300 ships crossing open ocean required more than courage and strong hulls. It required knowledge accumulated over centuries, encoded in instruments, documents, and the memories of men who had learned to read the sky, the water, and the slow turning of the seasons. Chinese mariners in the early 1500s inherited techniques from Arab, Indian, and Persian sailors who had navigated the Indian Ocean for 1,000 years, blending those traditions with their own innovations in cartography, compass work, and shipbuilding. The result was a navigational system sophisticated enough to guide thousands of men across waters where a single miscalculation could strand a ship far from any port or drive it onto reefs that appeared without warning beneath a calm surface. The magnetic compass stood at the center of that system. Chinese sailors had used compasses since at least the 11th century. and by Zheng He's time the instrument had evolved into a reliable tool for open water navigation. The compass rose was divided into 24 directional points, each corresponding to a specific bearing measured in degrees that modern sailors would recognize, though the terminology differed. A navigator aboard a treasure ship might record a heading as ding or zheng, terms drawn from the traditional system of earthly branches and heavenly stems, calibrated against the needle's alignment with magnetic north. These directions were recorded in written sailing instructions that described entire routes in sequences of compass bearings, distances measured in watches or days of travel, and observations of coastal landmarks. The integration of compass and text meant that a captain could follow a documented route even if he had never sailed it before, trusting the accumulated experience of earlier generations. But the compass alone could not tell a sailor where he was, only which direction he faced. For that, Chinese navigators turned to the stars. Celestial navigation in the Indian Ocean relied on measuring the altitude of key stars above the horizon, using that angle to estimate latitude. Northern Hemisphere sailors watched the pole star, noting how its height above the horizon increased as a ship sailed north. The method was simple in concept but required practice and clear skies. A navigator would sight the star through a wooden or bronze instrument, measuring its angle in finger widths or degrees, then compare that measurement to known values for different ports. South of the equator, where the pole star disappeared below the horizon, sailors relied on the Southern Cross and other constellations whose positions had been charted over decades of voyaging. Star charts carried aboard the treasure ships showed these constellations in stylized form, annotated with notes on seasonal visibility and the latitudes where specific stars reached their highest point. The knowledge was empirical, refined through trial and error, and jealously guarded by the pilots who possessed it. Written sailing directions, known as rutters, provided the third pillar of navigational knowledge. These documents combined compass bearings with descriptions of currents, reefs, safe anchorages, and the appearance of coastlines as seen from the sea. A rutter might note that after sailing southwest for 5 days from Malacca, a navigator should watch for a cluster of rocky islands, then turn more westward to catch the current towards Ceylon. It might warn of submerged shoals off the Malabar coast, visible only by the color of the water or the pattern of waves breaking over them. It might describe the depth of a harbor entrance, the landmarks that marked the safest approach, and the prevailing winds during each season. These rutters were compiled over generations by Arab, Indian, and Chinese mariners who shared information in the multilingual ports of the Indian Ocean, where practical knowledge mattered more than national origin. The treasure fleet's navigators carried copies of these texts, many of them translated or annotated by Muslim pilots who had sailed the routes before and understood both the technical details and the local languages. The monsoon winds made long-distance ocean travel possible, but they also imposed a strict calendar on maritime movement. The Indian Ocean's climate is governed by seasonal wind patterns that reverse direction twice a year. In winter, from roughly November to March, the northeast monsoon blows from the Asian mainland toward the equator and beyond, pushing ships southwest across the Bay of Bengal and the Arabian Sea. In summer, from June to September, the southwest monsoon reverses the flow, bringing moisture-laden winds from the ocean toward the land, and allowing ships to sail northeast back toward China. Zheng He's fleet departed from the Yangtze in winter, riding the favorable winds south through the Taiwan Strait and the South China Sea, reaching Southeast Asian ports within weeks. From there, the ships continued southwest, crossing the Bay of Bengal to India or pushing farther west to the Persian Gulf and the African coast. The entire outbound journey had to be completed before the winds shifted in late spring, leaving the fleet time to conduct diplomacy, trade, and resupply before catching the summer monsoon home. Missing the seasonal window meant waiting months in a foreign port, consuming provisions and risking illness or conflict. Navigating by monsoon required not just knowledge of wind patterns but an understanding of local variations and microclimates. The southwest monsoon, for instance, arrived earlier off the Malabar coast than in the Gulf of Aden, and the strength of the winds varied from year to year depending on conditions in the interior of Asia and Africa. Experienced pilots knew to watch for signs of the monsoon's approach, shifts in cloud cover, changes in sea temperature, the behavior of birds and fish, They also knew the dangerous periods when the winds were in transition, bringing unpredictable squalls and sudden calms that could leave a ship wallowing in heavy seas. The treasure fleet's schedule was built around these rhythms, with departure and return dates calculated to maximize favorable conditions and minimize risk. The ships themselves embodied centuries of Chinese maritime engineering designed for stability, cargo capacity, and survival in open ocean. The treasure ships and their smaller escorts featured watertight bulkheads, a structural innovation that divided the hull into separate compartments sealed with cork and wooden planks. If the hull was breached, water would flood only the affected compartment, leaving the rest of the ship buoyant and seaworthy. This technology, which would not appear in European vessels for several more centuries, gave Chinese ships a critical advantage in rough seas or combat. The balanced rudder, mounted on a central post that extended deep below the waterline, allowed precise steering even in strong currents. Unlike the steering oars used in earlier ships, the balanced rudder pivoted around a fixed axis, requiring less effort to control and providing better response in heavy weather. Depth sounding was essential for navigating shallow coastal waters and avoiding submerged hazards. Sailors lowered weighted ropes overboard, measuring the depth in fathoms and examining the material that clung to the weight when it was hauled back up. Sand, mud, shell fragments, and coral each indicated different types of seabed and helped confirm the ship's position relative to known charts. In unfamiliar waters, sounding was continuous, with leadsmen calling out depths to the helmsman and officers who judged whether to proceed or anchor. The treasure fleet's rutters often included notes on expected depths at specific points along a route, providing another layer of verification for navigators uncertain of their position. Freshwater posed one of the most serious logistical challenges of long voyages. A fleet of 20,000 men could exhaust its water supply in weeks, even with strict rationing. The treasure ships carried water in massive ceramic jars secured in the hold, but the supply had to be replenished regularly at ports along the way. Not every harbour had reliable freshwater sources, and some required ships to send boats upriver or dig wells on shore. The fleet's itinerary was shaped in part by the availability of water, with certain ports serving as essential resupply points where the ships would anchor for days while work crews ferried casks back and forth from shore. Rainwater collection provided some relief during the monsoon months, with canvas sheets rigged to funnel runoff into barrels, though the water often tasted of salt spray and mildew. The constant need for fresh provisions and water meant that the fleet could never stray far from inhabited coastlines, and the longest open water crossings, such as the leg from Sumatra to Ceylon, required careful planning and full holds before departure. But knowing where to go was only part of the challenge. The daily work of keeping such a fleet moving, fed, and seaworthy required constant labour and discipline. A treasure ship at anchor held more than 1,000 men, stacked in layers of command and function, and keeping them alive across months of open ocean required systems as intricate as the compass bearings that guided the hull. The grand directors and battalion commanders lived in private cabins near the stern, their quarters furnished with carved chairs and writing desks where they composed reports and consulted navigation charts. Below them, arranged in descending tiers of privilege, were the petty officers, the clerks, the interpreters, and finally the common sailors and soldiers, who slept in communal berths along the lower decks, their hammocks slung between the ribs of the hull. The air down there smelled of tar and bilge water and unwashed wool, and in the monsoon heat the wood sweated moisture that never fully dried. At night, when the ship rolled in open water, the creaking of the timbers and the snoring of 200 men blended into a rhythm that became, over weeks, the only sound anyone could remember. The ship operated on a strict schedule of watches, each lasting 2 hours, marked by the striking of bells and the rotation of crews. During each watch, sailors adjusted the sails to catch the wind, checked the rigging for fraying, and monitored the rudder for any drift off course. The larger treasure ships required teams of 6 or 8 men just to manage the massive balanced rudders, which were raised or lowered through slots in the hull using windlasses and rope tackles. When the wind shifted, the entire deck came alive with coordinated effort, hauling lines, resetting yards, tightening sheets. The officers who supervised this work had learned their trade over decades, often as boys apprenticed to their fathers, and they could read the behavior of a sail or the tension in a rope the way a physician reads a pulse. A poorly set sail could slow the fleet by days. A snapped line in a storm could dismember a man before anyone could react. Maintenance never stopped. The caulkers moved along the seams of the deck planking every few days, prying out old oakum and packing fresh fibers soaked in pine resin to keep the water out. Carpenters inspected the hull for cracks or soft spots where rot had begun, replacing boards when necessary with timber carried in the hold for exactly this purpose. Rope makers twisted new cordage from hemp, their hands stained dark from the oils, while sailmakers stitched patches onto torn canvas using needles the size of small daggers. The blacksmiths worked below deck in makeshift forges, repairing hinges, brackets, and tools that had bent or broken under constant strain. Even the soldiers, whose primary duty was to fight if the fleet encountered resistance, spent their idle hours scrubbing the decks with bricks of sandstone and seawater, a task that kept both the wood and the men from going soft. Idleness bred trouble, and a commander who allowed his crew to sit idle was asking for mutiny or worse. Food was the central obsession of life at sea, second only to water. The fleet carried vast quantities of rice, stored in clay jars sealed with wax to keep out moisture and rats, though both inevitably found their way in. Each man received a daily ration measured by the dough, a wooden scoop that held just over a liter, which was boiled in enormous cauldrons set up on deck when the weather allowed. The cooks added salted fish, dried vegetables, and occasionally a handful of soybeans, which could be soaked and sprouted to provide fresh greens even weeks from land. This practice, observed by fleets across the maritime world of the Indian Ocean, prevented the swollen gums and loose teeth that marked scurvy, though the sailors themselves did not understand why fresh sprouts worked where dried grain did not. When the fleet made port, the crews rushed to buy or barter for fresh provisions, coconuts, mangoes, chickens, goat meat. These luxuries disappeared within days, and the return to rice and salt fish felt like a punishment. Water was rationed more carefully than food. The ships carried it in massive ceramic jars stacked in the hold, each sealed and labelled by the clerk responsible for supplies. A man received roughly 2 liters per day for drinking, cooking, and washing, though in practice washing was often skipped to save the ration for more essential needs. When rain fell, every barrel and bucket on deck was pressed into service to catch the runoff from the sails, and the crew drank the fresh water with a gratitude that bordered on reverence. At ports with reliable springs or rivers, the water detail spent entire days ferrying casks from shore to ship, a labour so tedious and heavy that it was often assigned as punishment for minor infractions. Illness travelled with the fleet as faithfully as the wind. The shipboard doctors, trained in the herbal traditions of Song and Yuan medicine, carried chests filled with dried roots, bark, powdered minerals, and preserved animal parts, each ingredient matched to a specific humoral imbalance or organ system. For fevers, they prescribed bitter decoctions of artemisia and rhubarb. For digestive complaints, ginger and licorice. For wounds, they applied poultices of honey and ground pearl, which slowed infection through mechanisms no one could explain, but which observation had validated over centuries. The doctors also practiced acupuncture and moxibustion, burning cones of mugwort on specific points of the body to redirect the flow of qi. Whether these treatments worked better than doing nothing is a question the historical record cannot answer, but the men who recovered credited the doctors, and the men who died were buried at sea with their names recorded in logs that no longer survive. The psychological cost of the voyage was harder to treat than fever or dysentery. Months at sea, surrounded by the same faces and the same endless horizon, wore down even the most disciplined sailors. Men grew irritable, sullen, prone to outbursts over slights that on land would have passed unnoticed. Fights broke out over nothing, a stolen biscuit, a place to sleep, an insult half imagined. The officers dealt with these conflicts through a hierarchy of punishments, calibrated to the severity of the offence. Minor infractions earned extra labour or reduced rations. Repeated disobedience brought flogging with a bamboo cane, the blows delivered in front of the assembled crew to reinforce the cost of disorder. Serious crimes, such as theft of ship's stores or striking an officer, could result in confinement in the hold, or in extreme cases, execution. The fleet operated under martial law, and the authority of the commanders was absolute. A man who challenged that authority was challenging the emperor himself, and the consequences were swift. Religion provided structure and solace in a world where so much lay beyond human control. The fleet carried Buddhist monks who led prayers and chanted sutras at dawn and dusk, their voices rising above the creak of the rigging and the slap of the waves. Offerings were made to Tianfei, the goddess sailors called Mazu, whose protection was considered essential for safe passage. Her image, carved in wood or painted on silk, occupied a small shrine on every ship, where incense burned and sailors left tokens: a coin, a lock of hair, a scrap of cloth tied in a knot. When storms threatened, the crew gathered before the shrine and chanted her name, believing that her favor could calm the wind and part the clouds. Zheng He and the Muslim soldiers and interpreters aboard the fleet maintained their own devotions, praying 5 times daily in the direction of Mecca, their foreheads touching the deck, while the Buddhist sailors watched with a mixture of curiosity and indifference. The fleet was a floating microcosm of the empire's religious plurality, where different practices coexisted not out of philosophical tolerance, but out of practical necessity. At certain moments, the entire fleet paused for ceremony. Before departing on a new leg of the journey, the commanders gathered the crews and offered sacrifices of wine and incense to the sea and sky, asking for favorable winds and safe return. When a man died, his body was sewn into sailcloth weighted with stones and slid into the water, while a monk chanted prayers for his rebirth in a better realm. The ceremony was brief, almost perfunctory, because death at sea was common enough that prolonged mourning would have paralyzed the fleet. The man's belongings were inventoried and sent back to his family if the fleet returned to China. If not, they were distributed among the crew or sold at the next port. Boredom was the most persistent enemy, more grinding than hunger or thirst or fear. On calm days when the wind died and the ship sat motionless on glassy water, time stretched into something almost unbearable. Men repaired nets they had already repaired, told stories they had already told, gambled with dice carved from bone until their meager wages were gone. Some carved small figures from driftwood or scraps of bamboo, talismans they would carry for the rest of their lives. Others simply stared at the horizon, waiting for something, anything, to break the monotony. The officers knew that boredom bred trouble faster than hardship, and they invented tasks to keep the crews occupied. Drills with weapons, practice maneuvers, contests to see which team could hoist a sail fastest. These exercises served a dual purpose, maintaining both skill and morale, though the line between the two was often difficult to distinguish. When the fleet reached foreign shores, the work shifted from survival and maintenance to diplomacy, commerce, and the delicate theatre of imperial prestige. When the fleet reached foreign shores, the work shifted from survival and maintenance to diplomacy, commerce, and the delicate theatre of imperial prestige. Arrival in a major port meant days of careful choreography, messages sent ahead by fast boats, gifts inventoried and arranged in proper hierarchy, interpreters briefed on titles and protocols, and soldiers positioned to project strength without menace. The purpose was not conquest or extraction, but the performance of a relationship in which the Ming Emperor stood at the apex of civilization and foreign rulers acknowledged that position through ritual submission. What made this theatre effective was not just the size of the ships or the quality of the gifts, but the willingness of local rulers to participate in a fiction that served their own interests as much as China's. Malacca occupied a narrow strait between Sumatra and the Malay Peninsula, a bottleneck through which nearly all trade between the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea had to pass. Control of this waterway meant control over the movement of spices, textiles, ceramics, and timber across half the known world. In the early 1400s, Malacca was a young sultanate, founded around 1397 by Parameswara, a prince who had fled Palembang after a Javanese attack. The settlement grew quickly, attracting merchants from Java, Sumatra, India, and the Arab world. But it faced persistent pressure from the Kingdom of Ayutthaya, which considered the Malay Peninsula part of its sphere of influence and demanded tribute. When Zheng He's fleet arrived during the first voyage in 1405, Parameswara saw an opportunity. By accepting Ming titles and gifts, and by sending his own envoys back to Nanjing with tribute, he gained protection from a power far greater than Ayutthaya. The Chinese in turn secured a friendly port at the most strategically valuable location on their route west. The relationship was formalized through ritual. Parameswara received an imperial letter, written in formal literary Chinese, and translated by interpreters into Malay, conferring upon him the title of king and recognizing Malacca as a legitimate tributary state. He was presented with a seal, silk robes embroidered with dragon motifs, gold and silver vessels, and iron tools, all carefully selected to convey the emperor's generosity and the technological superiority of Chinese craftsmanship. In exchange, Parameswara offered local products, tin from nearby mines, pepper, camphor wood, and exotic birds. These goods had commercial value, but their primary function was symbolic. They represented the Sultan's acknowledgement that his authority derived, at least in theory, from the favor of the Ming court. The exchange was recorded in official documents carried back to Nanjing, where scribes added Malacca to the growing list of kingdoms that had submitted to the emperor's virtue. For Malacca, the benefits were immediate and practical. Siamese envoys stopped demanding tribute once it became clear that the Sultan enjoyed Chinese backing. Chinese merchants, both those attached to the treasure fleet and independent traders, began to favor Malacca over other ports, bringing demand for local goods and services. The Sultan invested in infrastructure, better docks, warehouses, and a more organized market. The city became a cosmopolitan entrepot, where Tamil, Gujarati, Persian, Arab, Malay, and Chinese merchants lived in separate quarters, each with their own headmen and mosques or temples, but all subject to the Sultan's authority. Zheng He returned to Malacca on every subsequent voyage, reinforcing the relationship and ensuring that the strait remained open to Chinese ships. The fiction of tributary submission served both parties so well that it required little enforcement. Calicut, on the southwestern coast of India in what is now Kerala, operated on a larger scale and with a longer history. The city was ruled by the Zamarin, a Hindu monarch whose title meant Lord of the Sea, and who presided over one of the most important spice markets in the world. Black pepper, cardamom, ginger, cinnamon and cloves passed through Calicut's warehouses, brought from the interior of India and from the islands of Southeast Asia, then shipped west to the Persian Gulf, the Red Sea, and beyond. The city's prosperity rested on its openness to foreign merchants. Arabs, Persians, Jews, Christians from Mesopotamia, and traders from East Africa maintained permanent communities there, each with legal protections and the right to conduct business according to their own customs. The Zamarin taxed trade but did not monopolize it, preferring to profit from volume rather than control. When Zheng He's fleet arrived in Calicut, probably during the first voyage in 1406, the Zamarin welcomed them with the practiced ease of a ruler accustomed to foreign dignitaries. The Chinese presented imperial letters and gifts, rolls of silk in colors that Indian dyers could not yet replicate, porcelain bowls from Jingdezhen, so fine they rang when struck, iron cooking pots, and agricultural tools forged in quantities no Indian workshop could match, and luxury items like lacquerware and jade carvings intended to demonstrate the emperor's refinement. The Zamarin responded with pepper by the ton, precious stones including rubies and sapphires mined in Sri Lanka and southern India, medicinal herbs, fragrant woods, and samples of the fine cotton textiles for which the region was famous. He sent envoys back to Nanjing on the returning fleet, carrying letters that acknowledged the emperor's greatness in terms carefully crafted to satisfy Chinese expectations without actually conceding subordination. The tributary ritual in Calicut was more flexible than in Malacca, because the Zamarin did not need Chinese protection and could afford to treat the exchange as commercial diplomacy rather than submission. Chinese records describe him as a tributary king, but Indian sources make no mention of subordination to a foreign emperor. The discrepancy reveals the practical limits of the tributary system. It worked best when both parties found it useful to maintain the fiction, and it required constant reinforcement through repeated visits, gift exchanges, and the physical presence of the fleet. Zheng He returned to Calicut on every voyage, and the relationship remained stable, because the Zamarin profited from Chinese trade and saw no reason to challenge the symbolic language that came with it. The goods exchanged were never equal in a strictly commercial sense, and they were not supposed to be. The Chinese gave lavishly to demonstrate the emperor's wealth and generosity, expecting nothing equivalent in return beyond acknowledgement of his superiority. Local rulers reciprocated with products that, while valuable, were understood to be offerings rather than payment. Porcelain, silk, and iron tools flowed outward from China. Spices, gems, medicinal plants, ivory, and exotic animals flowed back. The fleet also acquired giraffes from East Africa, lions, leopards, zebras, and ostriches, all of which were transported to Nanjing and presented to the emperor as tribute from distant kings. The giraffe brought back in 1414 was celebrated as a Killen, a mythical creature whose appearance was thought to signify virtuous rule. Whether the animal was actually given by an African ruler or purchased from merchants was irrelevant. What mattered was that it could be framed as tribute. Interpreters made the entire system possible, and most of them were Muslims. Men like Ma Huan, who sailed on 3 voyages and later wrote an account of his travels, and Fei Jin, who compiled a similar record, spoke Arabic, Persian, and sometimes Tamil or Malay in addition to Chinese. They translated letters, negotiated terms, explained ritual expectations, and mediated misunderstandings that could have escalated into conflict. Their linguistic skills were essential, but so was their cultural fluency. They understood that a phrase acceptable in one context might be insulting in another, that gifts had to be presented in a specific order, and that timing mattered as much as content. The limits of mutual understanding were real. Chinese officials often failed to grasp the political structures of the kingdoms they visited, describing them in terms that fit Chinese categories rather than local realities. Foreign rulers, for their part, did not always understand what the Chinese wanted, and some complied with tributary rituals simply because it was easier than refusing. Not every encounter was peaceful. The fleet also confronted piracy, local resistance, and the occasional need to enforce the emperor's will through violence. The treasure fleet carried more than silk and porcelain. In the holds of the escort vessels, soldiers stacked crossbows, fire lances, and grenades packed with gunpowder and shrapnel. On the decks of the largest ships, bronze cannons stood mounted on swiveling frames, their barrels cast in the foundries of Nanjing and designed to punch through wooden hulls at close range. Zheng He commanded not just a diplomatic mission but a floating garrison capable of projecting force across thousands of miles of open water. The fleet rarely sought confrontation, but when challenged, it responded with a clarity that left little room for negotiation. The first serious test came in the summer of 1407, off the coast of Palembang in southern Sumatra. The city sat near the mouth of the Musi River, a strategic position that had once made it the heart of the Srivijaya maritime empire. By the early 15th century, that empire had long since fragmented, but the waters around Palembang remained contested and dangerous. A Chinese pirate named Chen Zui controlled much of the Strait of Malacca, extorting tribute from merchant vessels and raiding coastal settlements with a fleet of fast, shallow-draft junks. He had operated with near impunity for years, his network extending from the strait to the South China Sea, and his reputation among sailors was built on ruthlessness and an intimate knowledge of the currents and islands that could hide a dozen ships. Zheng He knew Chen Zui by name before the fleet reached Sumatra. The pirate had been a problem for Ming authorities since the Hongwu reign, and his control over the strait represented both a practical threat to trade and a symbolic challenge to imperial authority. When the treasure fleet anchored near Palembang, local informants confirmed that Chen Zui was nearby, likely planning an ambush. The details of what followed survive in multiple sources, including the official Ming histories and inscriptions Zheng He commissioned at temples after the voyage. Chen Zui reportedly approached under false pretenses, signaling peaceful intent while positioning his ships for a sudden attack. Whether he underestimated the size of the treasure fleet or simply gambled that surprise would be enough is unclear. What is certain is that Zheng He anticipated the betrayal. The engagement was brief and decisive. The treasure ships, anchored in deeper water, used their height advantage to rain crossbow bolts and incendiary projectiles onto the pirate junks as they closed. Fire lances, bamboo tubes packed with gunpowder and metal fragments, turned the decks of the nearest vessels into chaos. The Ming fleet had trained marines, men who drilled in coordinated volleys and amphibious landings, and they moved with a discipline that pirate crews, however experienced, could not match. Chen Zhuyi attempted to retreat into the shallows where the larger Chinese ships could not follow, but Zheng He had deployed smaller escort vessels for precisely this contingency. The pirates were surrounded, their escape routes blocked, and within hours the battle was over. Chen Zhuyi was captured alive, along with several of his captains. They were bound, loaded onto a treasure ship, and carried back to Nanjing, where the Yongle Emperor had them publicly executed as a demonstration of what happened to those who defied the imperial order. The suppression of Chen Zhuyi served multiple purposes. It cleared a critical shipping lane, reassured regional rulers nervous about piracy, and established the treasure fleet as something more than a caravan of merchants. It was a signal that the Ming court could enforce its will far from home, and that submission carried rewards while resistance invited destruction. The message was not lost on the rulers of Malacca, whose sultan received Chinese recognition and protection shortly afterward, or on the merchants who depended on safe passage through the strait. For Zheng He personally, the victory reinforced his reputation as both diplomat and commander, a man capable of shifting seamlessly between the rituals of tribute and the calculations of war. 4 years later, the fleet faced a different kind of challenge, this time in Ceylon. The island sat astride the main route between the Malabar coast and the Strait of Malacca, and its ports provided fresh water, provisions, and access to cinnamon, pearls, and gemstones. The Cottic Kingdom, which controlled much of the western and southern coast, was ruled by a king named Vira Alexvara, a figure the Chinese records refer to with a mix of formality and disdain. The details of what happened in 1411 are contested, with Chinese and Sinhalese sources offering sharply different accounts. According to the Ming histories, Vira Alexvara attempted to ambush Zheng He and his officers during a diplomatic visit, possibly motivated by resentment over tributary demands or a miscalculation about the fleet's strength. The trap allegedly involved luring the Chinese delegation inland while blocking their return to the ships. Zheng He, according to these accounts, recognized the danger and acted quickly. Rather than retreating, he led a small force directly toward the royal capital, moving faster than the king's messengers and catching the court unprepared. The exact sequence of events is unclear, but the outcome is not. Vira Alexvara was captured, along with his family and senior advisors, and brought aboard the treasure ships. The fleet then departed Ceylon, carrying the deposed king across the Indian Ocean to Nanjing, where he was paraded before the Yongle Emperor as a lesson in the consequences of treachery. The emperor, in a gesture that combined magnanimity with calculated symbolism, eventually released Vira Alexvara and sent him home, though not before installing a more compliant ruler in his place. The incident left a deep mark on Ceylonese politics, and Chinese influence on the island remained strong for decades. The military capabilities that made these interventions possible were carefully maintained and constantly drilled. The treasure fleet was not a warship armada in the European sense. It was designed primarily for transport, diplomacy, and endurance, but embedded within the fleet were vessels and personnel whose sole purpose was combat. The escort ships carried marines trained in crossbow volleys, hand-to-hand fighting, and the use of early firearms like fire lances and hand cannons. These weapons were crude by later standards, but at close range they were devastating, especially against opponents unfamiliar with gunpowder. The larger ships mounted bronze cannons that fired stone or iron balls, effective for breaching wooden fortifications or sinking smaller craft. The fleet also carried incendiary devices, smoke bombs and caltrops, small spiked obstacles scattered on decks to disrupt boarding parties. Training was continuous. During the long passages between ports, soldiers practiced formations, drilled with their weapons, and ran through scenarios for landing operations and defensive engagements. Officers studied maps and coastal profiles, identifying points where ambushes might occur and planning responses. The fleet operated under a strict code of conduct enforced by military law, and punishments for desertion, insubordination, or cowardice were severe. This discipline was not just for show, it was the foundation of the fleet's effectiveness. A force of 20,000 men could not be controlled through charisma alone, especially when confined to ships for months and faced with the temptations and tensions of foreign ports. The balance between diplomacy and coercion was delicate and constantly recalibrated. The fleet did not arrive at every port with cannons ready and soldiers on alert. Most encounters followed the scripted rituals of tributary exchange, the presentation of imperial letters, the bestowal of titles and gifts, the acceptance of local products as symbols of submission. Violence was reserved for moments when those rituals broke down, when rulers refused to acknowledge Chinese superiority, or when piracy and banditry threatened the stability that trade required. The fleet's reputation did much of the work. By the third or fourth voyage, the mere arrival of the treasure ships was often enough to secure cooperation. Local rulers knew what had happened to Chen Zhui and Vira Alekasvara, and most preferred the benefits of Chinese patronage to the risks of resistance. The long-term impact on regional politics was uneven and complex. In Malacca, Chinese support helped establish a sultanate that would dominate the strait for generations, creating a stable hub for trade and a loyal tributary. In Ceylon, the deposition of Vira Alekasvara destabilized the Kotic kingdom and contributed to decades of internal conflict, though it also opened the island to greater Chinese commercial access. In Java, where the fleet intervened in a succession dispute during the first voyage, the outcome strengthened one faction at the expense of another, reshaping the island's political landscape in ways that outlasted the voyages themselves. Some rulers sought Chinese patronage eagerly, sending embassies to Nanjing and competing for imperial recognition. Others resented the intrusion, viewing the treasure fleet as a tool of coercion dressed in the language of civilization. A few, like the pirate lords and independent coastal chiefs, were simply swept aside, their power broken by a force they could neither match nor evade. The fleet's capacity for violence was real, but it was also constrained. Zheng He commanded a massive force, but it was dispersed across hundreds of ships, operating thousands of miles from home, dependent on local provisions and vulnerable to storms, disease, and the simple logistics of coordinating so many vessels. Prolonged military campaigns were not feasible. The fleet could strike quickly and decisively, but it could not occupy territory or sustain a siege. Its power was most effective when applied sparingly, as a demonstration rather than a campaign. This restraint was partly practical and partly ideological. The Ming court saw itself as the center of a civilized world, and the tributary system was designed to incorporate foreign rulers without direct conquest. The fleet's mission was to bring distant kingdoms into that system, not to replace them with Chinese governors. Force was a tool of last resort, used when submission could not be secured through gifts, titles, and the theater of imperial majesty. Beyond the familiar waters of Southeast Asia and India, the fleet ventured farther west into the Persian Gulf and down the African coast, where the world grew stranger and the distances more daunting. The ships that reached Hormuz in the winter of 1414 and 1415 had sailed farther from Nanjing than most Chinese sailors had ever imagined. The distance from Calicut on the Malabar coast to the islands of the Persian Gulf measured more than 1,000 nautical miles, and the journey required trusting monsoon winds across open water where no landmarks guided the way. For those aboard the treasure fleet, these western ports represented the edge of the known world, places mentioned in old texts but rarely visited, where the spice trade gave way to frankincense and myrrh, and the languages spoken bore no resemblance to anything heard in Fujian or Guangdong. Yet Hormuz was not some remote outpost clinging to survival. It was one of the richest trading cities in the world, and the treasure fleet's arrival there marked the farthest westward expansion of Ming naval power. Hormuz sat on a barren island near the mouth of the Persian Gulf, a location so desolate that nearly everything consumed or used by its inhabitants had to be imported. Fresh water arrived by boat from the mainland. Timber came from India. Food was brought in from Persia and Arabia, but geography had given Hormuz something more valuable than fertile soil: control over the strait through which nearly all maritime trade between the Indian Ocean and the Persian interior had to pass. Ships carrying silk from China, spices from the Moluccas, gems from Ceylon, and cotton from Gujarat all stopped at Hormuz to exchange cargoes with merchants bringing Persian horses, Central Asian turquoise, Mesopotamian dates, and Arabian incense. The city's rulers collected customs duties on this vast flow of goods, and they grew wealthy enough to construct palaces, mosques, and warehouses that astonished foreign visitors. By the time Zheng He's fleet arrived, Hormuz had been a regional power for more than a century, surviving through diplomacy, bribery, and the occasional well-timed alliance with whichever Central Asian dynasty controlled Persia at the moment. The treasure fleet did not come to conquer Hormuz or demand submission in any formal sense. The distance made sustained military control impossible, and the fleet's logistical lifeline already stretched thin across thousands of miles of ocean. Instead, the fleet's officers sought to establish tributary relations, a framework familiar to Chinese diplomacy, but foreign to the rulers of Hormuz, who were accustomed to negotiating with Persian kings and Arab merchants on more equal terms. The gifts presented by Zheng He's representatives included porcelain from Jingdezhen, silk brocades, iron tools, and carefully written letters from the Yongle emperor proclaiming the virtues of harmony and mutual benefit. In return, the fleet received pearls, coral, precious stones, and exotic goods rarely seen in China. The language of the exchanges suggested subordination from the Chinese perspective, but the reality was more transactional. Hormuz accepted the ritual because it opened access to Chinese markets, and the Ming court accepted token gestures because they reinforced the fiction that all foreign rulers recognized imperial authority. The goods traded at Hormuz revealed the city's position at the intersection of multiple trading networks. Merchants from Basra and Baghdad brought dates, rosewater, and glassware. Traders from Gujarat and Cambay arrived with cotton textiles dyed in vibrant reds and blues. Venetian and Genoese agents, operating through intermediaries, exchanged European silver and copper for spices and silk. The treasure fleet's interpreters, many of them Muslims fluent in Persian and Arabic, moved through the crowded markets recording what they saw, asking questions about trade routes, political alliances, and the customs of distant kingdoms. One of these interpreters, Ma Hong, later wrote that Hormuz was a place where men from 100 nations gathered, speaking languages he could not identify, and wearing clothing he had never seen. The city operated under Islamic law, but its population included Zoroastrians, Christians, Hindus, and Jews, each community maintaining its own quarter, temple, and burial ground. For the Chinese sailors and officials, Hormuz offered a glimpse of a world organized along principles utterly foreign to the Confucian order they knew. Sailing west from Hormuz, smaller squadrons of the treasure fleet turned south toward the Arabian Peninsula, following routes used by Arab and Indian merchants for centuries. The port of Aden, perched on volcanic rock at the entrance to the Red Sea, controlled access to one of the most valuable trade routes in the world. Ships departing Aden could sail north into the Red Sea toward Egypt and the Mediterranean, or south along the African coast toward the kingdoms of the interior. The city's markets overflowed with frankincense and myrrh, resins harvested from trees growing in the arid highlands of southern Arabia and Somalia. These substances were burned in temples and homes across Asia, valued for their fragrance and their use in medicine and embalming. Chinese demand for incense was substantial, driven by Buddhist and Taoist rituals, and the treasure fleet's officers purchased large quantities to bring back to Nanjing. Aden also traded in coffee, though the beverage had not yet spread beyond the Arabian Peninsula, and in textiles woven from cotton grown in Yemen's mountain valleys. The political situation in Aden was more precarious than in Hormuz. The city was ruled by a sultan who owed nominal allegiance to the Mamluk Sultanate in Egypt, but in practice operated independently, balancing the interests of local merchants, tribal leaders from the interior, and foreign traders who could redirect their business to rival ports if conditions grew unfavorable. The arrival of the treasure fleet, with its enormous ships and thousands of armed men, created both opportunity and anxiety. The Sultan welcomed the trade and the prestige of receiving an embassy from the Ming Emperor, but he also worried that the fleet's presence might provoke the Mamluks or disrupt existing commercial arrangements. The exchanges at Aden followed a similar pattern to those at Hormuz. Gifts were presented, tribute was symbolically offered, and goods were traded in quantities large enough to satisfy both sides without requiring sustained political commitments. The treasure fleet did not linger in Aden. The harbour was exposed to strong winds and the surrounding terrain offered little in the way of provisions. Once the incense and other goods were loaded, the ships departed, turning south toward the African coast. The Swahili coast, stretching from Mogadishu in the north to Sofala in the south, was the farthest point reached by the treasure fleet, a world as distant from Nanjing as the imagination could reasonably stretch. The cities along this coast, Mogadishu, Malindi, Mombasa and Zanzibar among them, had grown prosperous through trade in gold, ivory and enslaved people, brought from the interior of Africa and exchanged for textiles, beads and metalwork from India and the Persian Gulf. These were not isolated villages but sophisticated urban centers, built from coral stone, governed by Muslim sultans of mixed African and Arab descent, and connected by networks of commerce and kinship that spanned the Indian Ocean. The treasure fleet's arrival in these ports, likely during the fourth voyage in 1413 and 1414, astonished local rulers and merchants who had never seen ships of such size or fleets of such scale. The goods acquired along the Swahili coast reflected the region's unique resources. Ivory, harvested from elephants hunted in the interior, was prized in China for carving decorative objects and inlays. Ambergris, a waxy substance produced in the intestines of sperm whales and found floating in the ocean or washed ashore, was used in perfumes and medicine. Gold dust and nuggets, brought overboard from the Kingdom of Great Zimbabwe and other inland polities, added to the treasure fleet's already substantial cargo of precious materials. But the most famous acquisition from East Africa was not a commodity at all. In 1414, the fleet returned to Nanjing with a giraffe, presented as a gift by the Sultan of Malindi. The animal, tall as a small building and covered in a geometric pattern of brown and cream, caused a sensation at the Ming court. Scholars identified it as a qilin, a mythical creature described in ancient texts as an omen of virtuous rule. The Yongle emperor, always attentive to symbols that reinforced his legitimacy, accepted the interpretation and ordered artists to paint the giraffe standing in the imperial gardens, attended by a handler and admired by court officials. The image was copied and distributed, becoming one of the most enduring icons of the treasure fleet's achievements. The logistical challenges of reaching these distant shores were immense. The fleet could not carry enough rice, water and other provisions to sustain 20,000 men for the months required to sail from China to East Africa and back. Instead, the fleet relied on a strategy of resupply at each major port, purchasing or requisitioning food, water, and repair materials as needed. This approach required careful planning and advanced coordination with local rulers, who were often willing to provide provisions in exchange for gifts or trade concessions. It also meant that the fleet was vulnerable to political changes or supply disruptions at any point along the route. If a local ruler proved hostile or if monsoon patterns shifted unexpectedly, the fleet could find itself stranded far from home with limited options. To mitigate these risks, the fleet often divided into smaller squadrons, each responsible for a specific leg of the journey or a particular diplomatic mission. These squadrons operated semi-independently, following written instructions from Zheng He and his senior officers, and reuniting at predetermined ports before the return journey. The coordination required to keep these squadrons supplied, informed, and on schedule across thousands of miles of ocean represented an extraordinary feat of organization, one that depended on the skills of navigators, interpreters, and clerks who maintained records and transmitted messages between ships. The physical strain of such long voyages took a toll on ships and men alike. The treasure ships, despite their robust construction, required constant maintenance. Salt water corroded iron fittings and weakened rope. Tropical heat and humidity caused wood to swell and split. Barnacles and other marine organisms attached to hulls, slowing progress and requiring periodic careening to scrape them off. Sailors and soldiers suffered from the monotony of months at sea, from the diseases that spread in crowded quarters, and from the injuries that came with working rigging and handling cargo in rough weather. The fleet's medical staff treated scurvy with sprouted beans and fresh fruit when available, but many men still fell ill or died before reaching home. The psychological toll was harder to quantify but no less real. For sailors from Fujian or Guangdong, the sight of African coasts and Arab cities must have been both fascinating and alienating. A world so different from anything they knew that it challenged their understanding of how human societies could be organized. After 2 decades of expeditions, political winds in Beijing began to shift, and the voyages that had seemed essential to the Yongle Emperor came to be seen as wasteful and dangerous by his successors. The treasure fleet returned from its 6th voyage in the summer of 1421, its holds filled with tribute and its crews exhausted from 3 years at sea. The Yongle Emperor, who had commissioned every expedition since 1405, reviewed the gifts and the diplomatic reports, but his attention had already shifted northward. The Mongol remnants beyond the Great Wall remained a persistent threat, and the emperor spent his final years leading military campaigns into the steppe, far from the docks where his great ships sat idle. When he died in 1424 during his 5th northern campaign, the political logic that had sustained the voyages died with him. His son, the Hongji Emperor, inherited a treasury strained by decades of ambitious projects and a court divided over priorities. The new emperor ruled for less than a year, but his brief reign set the tone for what followed: consolidation, retrenchment, and a growing skepticism toward ventures that drained resources without obvious returns. The Hongxi Emperor and his successor, the Xuande Emperor, faced a Ming state that was vastly more expensive to operate than their father had acknowledged. The northern frontier required constant investment in walls, garrisons, and cavalry forces to counter raids and prevent larger incursions. The Grand Canal, which linked the rice-producing south to the capital in Beijing, needed dredging, repair, and an army of laborers to keep goods flowing. The imperial clan itself had grown enormous, with princes and their households supported by stipends from state coffers. Revenue, meanwhile, had not kept pace. The land tax remained the primary source of income, but population displacement, tax evasion by wealthy families, and corruption in the collection system meant that less silver reached Beijing than the ledgers suggested. The treasure voyages had never been designed to turn a profit. They consumed timber, rice, labor, and military resources on a staggering scale. The goods brought back, exotic animals and tributary tokens and symbolic submissions, held prestige value, but could not feed soldiers or repair canals. Confucian officials in the civil bureaucracy, many of whom had resented the voyages from the start, saw an opportunity. They had long opposed the political influence of eunuchs like Zheng He, whose power derived from personal loyalty to the emperor rather than merit earned through the examination system. The voyages represented everything they distrusted: eunuch authority, military adventurism, and engagement with foreign peoples who offered little of value to the Confucian project of moral governance. Memorials submitted to the throne argued that the expeditions wasted resources better spent on agriculture, education, and defense. One official compared the voyages to pouring water into sand, an endless expenditure with no lasting benefit. Another pointed out that the tributary system already functioned without fleets. Foreign rulers sent envoys overland or aboard their own vessels, and China could receive them without sailing halfway across the world. The critiques carried weight not because they were new, many had circulated since the first voyage, but because the emperors who followed Yongle were more inclined to listen. The ideological framework mattered as much as the budget. Confucian statecraft held that the emperor's primary duty was to govern the realm with virtue, ensuring that agriculture flourished, justice prevailed, and the rituals that connected heaven and earth were performed correctly. Foreign relations fit within this cosmology, but only as extensions of the emperor's moral authority. Barbarian kings who recognized their inferior position and sent tribute were welcomed. Those who did not could be ignored or punished. The treasure voyages complicated this tidy picture. They projected power, certainly, but they also revealed dependence. The fleet required foreign timber, foreign pilots, and cooperation from foreign rulers, who did not always see themselves as subordinate. The expense and effort seemed disproportionate to the goal. If China truly stood at the center of civilization, why did it need to chase after acknowledgement from kingdoms at the edge of the known world? The question hung over court debates, rarely stated so bluntly, but implicit in every argument against resuming the expeditions. Zheng He himself remained loyal to the vision of the Yongle Emperor, but his influence waned after his patron's death. The Hongxi Emperor showed no interest in maritime ventures and reportedly considered dismantling the fleet entirely. Zheng He spent the mid-1420s in semi-retirement, his title intact but his authority diminished. The Xuande Emperor, who took the throne in 1426, proved slightly more sympathetic. He had accompanied his grandfather on northern campaigns and admired the old emperor's boldness, if not always his judgment. In 1430, citing concerns about piracy and the need to reassert Chinese influence in Southeast Asia, the Xuande Emperor authorized a seventh voyage. The decision faced immediate resistance from the Ministry of Revenue and the Censorate, both of which filed protests. The emperor overruled them, but the voyage was framed as a final expedition, a gesture of continuity rather than the start of a new cycle. Zheng He, now in his 60s, resumed command. The fleet that departed in the winter of 1430 and 31 was smaller than earlier expeditions, perhaps 100 ships rather than 200 or 300, and its mission was narrow: visit familiar ports, renew tributary relationships, and return quickly. The seventh voyage reached Hormuz and ports along the Indian coast, following routes established over the previous 3 decades. The fleet returned to Nanjing in 1433, though whether Zheng He survived the journey remains uncertain. Some sources suggest he died at sea and was buried at Calicut. Others place his death shortly after arriving home. Either way, the man who had commanded every treasure voyage was gone, and with him the last figure capable of defending the expeditions against their critics. The Xuande Emperor died in 1435, and his successor, the Zhengtung Emperor, was a child. Power passed to regents and senior officials who had no personal connection to the voyages and no interest in reviving them. The treasure ships were left moored at the Longjing shipyard, their hulls slowly rotting. Some were cannibalized for timber, others simply decayed into the mud. No 8th voyage was planned. The infrastructure that had built and sustained the fleet, the shipwrights and the navigators and the supply networks, was gradually repurposed or disbanded. What happened next was stranger than simple neglect. In 1477, an official named Liu Daxia was asked to retrieve the records of the treasure voyages from the Ministry of War archives. The documents, which included detailed logs, maps, and accounts of expenditures, would have been invaluable for understanding the expeditions and potentially planning future ventures. Liu Daxia reportedly found the records and destroyed them, or hid them so thoroughly that they were never recovered. His reasoning, if the story is true, was straightforward. The voyages had been wasteful and dangerous, and preserving their records would only tempt future emperors to repeat the mistake. Whether this act of sabotage actually occurred is debated. The story survives in later histories that may have exaggerated or invented it, but the outcome is not in doubt. By the late 1500s, official knowledge of the voyages had been reduced to brief entries in dynastic histories and fragmentary accounts by a few participants who had written memoirs. The maps were gone, the ships were gone, and the institutional memory of how to organize such expeditions had dissolved. The suppression reflected deeper anxieties. The mid-15th century saw the Ming state struggling with renewed Mongol aggression, including a catastrophic defeat in 1449, when the Zhengtong Emperor was captured during a failed campaign. The capital itself was threatened, and the court became obsessed with defense and internal stability. Maritime ventures seemed not just irrelevant but reckless, a distraction from existential threats closer to home. The Confucian consensus hardened China's security and prosperity lay in controlling its borders, managing its agriculture, and maintaining social order, not in chasing prestige across distant oceans. By the late 1500s, the treasure voyages had become an embarrassment, a reminder of eunuch excess and imperial overreach. With the voyages ended, and the ships left to rot in the dockyards, the memory of the treasure fleet faded, but the material traces and the systems it revealed continued to shape the world. The treasure fleet was never simply an exercise in navigation or diplomacy. It was a physical expression of how the Ming court understood the world, organized power, and justified its place at the center of civilization. The ships that crossed the Indian Ocean carried more than porcelain and silk. They carried assumptions about hierarchy, legitimacy, and the proper relationship between the emperor and everyone else. To understand what the voyages reveal about early Ming China, one must look past the spectacle of giant ships and examine the systems that built them, the beliefs that justified them, and the limits that ultimately constrained them. At the heart of Ming foreign policy stood the tributary system, a framework older than the dynasty itself, but refined and expanded under the Yongle emperor. The system rested on a simple cosmological claim. The emperor held the mandate of heaven, and all legitimate rulers derived their authority by acknowledging his supremacy. In practice, this meant that foreign kings sent envoys to Beijing bearing gifts described as tribute, performed rituals of submission before the throne, and received in return imperial recognition, lavish countergifts, and access to Chinese markets. The language was hierarchical, but the reality was more pragmatic. Tributary status allowed kingdoms to trade legally with China, often at favorable rates, and to invoke imperial protection against rivals. For the Ming court, the system provided a steady flow of exotic goods, intelligence about distant lands, and the symbolic validation of universal rule. The treasure fleet turned this ritual into theater on an unprecedented scale. Rather than waiting for envoys to arrive in Beijing, Zheng He brought the emperor's authority directly to foreign courts, distributing titles, bestowing gifts, and enrolling new kingdoms into the tributary network. The fleet's size and splendor were not accidental. They were designed to overwhelm, to make submission seem not only prudent but inevitable. The voyages also illuminate the peculiar role of eunuchs in Ming governance. Zheng He was not an anomaly. By the early 1500s, eunuchs controlled much of the inner palace bureaucracy, managed imperial workshops, commanded military expeditions, and served as the emperor's most trusted agents. Their power derived precisely from their castration. Lacking families and unable to produce heirs, eunuchs posed no dynastic threat. They could accumulate wealth and influence, but that influence died with them. For emperors wary of aristocratic families and Confucian bureaucrats with their own agendas, eunuchs offered loyalty untainted by lineage. Zheng He's background made him especially valuable. Born into a Muslim family in Yunnan, captured as a boy during Ming campaigns, castrated and trained in the household of the Prince of Yan, he combined military competence, multilingual capability, and personal devotion to the Yongle emperor. His religion was an asset, not a liability. Islam had deep roots along the maritime trade routes, and Zheng He could negotiate with Muslim merchants and rulers in ways Confucian officials could not. His command of the treasure fleet reflected the emperor's preference for personal agents over ministerial institutions. The voyages bypassed the Ministry of Rights, which traditionally managed tributary relations, and placed enormous resources directly under eunuch control. Confucian officials resented this arrangement. They saw eunuchs as corrupt, uneducated meddlers in affairs they did not understand. The voyages became a focal point for these tensions, and after the Yongle emperor's death, the bureaucracy worked steadily to dismantle eunuch influence over foreign policy. The treasure fleet coexisted uneasily with other forms of maritime activity. Private traders had been sailing between China and Southeast Asia for centuries, exchanging ceramics, tea, and metalwork for spices, hardwoods, and medicinal herbs. Much of this trade was illegal. Ming law restricted private overseas commerce, partly to maintain state control over lucrative goods, and partly because Confucian ideology deemed merchants morally suspect and foreign entanglements corrupting. In practice, enforcement was inconsistent. Fujian and Guangdong merchants ignored the prohibitions, operating through networks of kin and guild that stretched across the South China Sea. Some traded openly in ports where local officials looked the other way. Others engaged in smuggling, piracy, or both. The treasure fleet did not eliminate this trade. It complicated it. Zheng He's expeditions established official channels for acquiring foreign goods, but those channels were slow, ritualized, and reserved for the state. Private traders moved faster, responded to market demand, and often undercut official prices. The Ming court faced a persistent dilemma: how to monopolize the symbolic and material benefits of foreign trade without creating a navy large enough to patrol thousands of miles of coastline. The solution was selective enforcement. The state cracked down on piracy when it threatened order, tolerated quiet commerce when it enriched local economies, and occasionally co-opted successful traders by granting them official titles and absorbing their networks into the tributary system. The treasure fleet represented the state's ideal vision of foreign commerce: centralized, hierarchical, and politically controlled. The reality on the water was messier. Driven by merchants the court could neither fully suppress nor fully regulate. The technological sophistication of the fleet was real, even if some details remain debated. Chinese shipbuilding in the early 1500s surpassed anything available in Europe or the Middle East in terms of scale, structural integrity, and navigational precision. Watertight bulkheads, a feature borrowed from earlier river barges and refined for ocean-going vessels, allowed ships to survive hull breaches that would sink a European carrack. Balanced rudders mounted on stern posts and adjustable through ropes and pulleys gave helmsmen finer control in variable winds. Magnetic compasses had been used in Chinese navigation since the 11th century, and by Zheng He's time, sailors worked with detailed rutters that recorded bearings, landmarks, and seasonal wind patterns for routes across the Indian Ocean. Star charts allowed navigators to fix latitude by measuring the height of the pole star or Southern Cross above the horizon. These were not crude instruments. They reflected centuries of accumulated knowledge refined through trial and error and transmitted through professional networks of pilots and captains. European navigators in the early 1400s still relied heavily on coastal sailing and dead reckoning. The Portuguese would not round the Cape of Good Hope until 1488. More than 80 years after Zheng He's first voyage. The Spanish crossing of the Pacific would wait until 1521. Chinese ships in the Indian Ocean were not exploring unknown waters. They were following established routes, visiting ports that had traded with China for generations, and using tools that made long-distance navigation routine rather than heroic. The fleet's technological edge lay not in discovery, but in scale and institutional coordination. The ability to build hundreds of ships to consistent specifications, to provision them for months at sea, and to navigate them as a coordinated unit across thousands of miles required state capacity and bureaucratic infrastructure that few other polities could match. Yet for all their technical and organizational prowess, the treasure fleets reveal the limits of Ming ambition. The voyagers sought neither conquest nor colonization. Zheng He did not claim territory, establish permanent garrisons, or attempt to govern the kingdoms he visited. The fleet enforced Ming interests when challenged, as it did against the pirate Chen Zui or the obstinate king of Ceylon, but violence was the exception, not the rule. The goal was symbolic submission and commercial access, not territorial control. This restraint reflected ideological convictions as much as practical constraints. Confucian political theory held that virtuous rule attracted voluntary submission. The emperor governed through moral example, not brute force. Conquest implied that virtue alone was insufficient, a troubling admission for a dynasty that justified its authority through heavenly mandate. The tributary system allowed the Ming court to claim universal authority without the costs and risks of occupation. Foreign rulers acknowledged Chinese superiority in ritual, received gifts and titles, and governed their own lands as they saw fit. The arrangement satisfied the court's need for symbolic dominance while avoiding the burdens of direct administration. The treasure fleet projected power, but it did not establish empire in any territorial sense. It created a network of relationships, not a chain of colonies. This approach contrasted sharply with the European expansions that followed. Portuguese and Spanish expeditions sought gold, land, and converts. They established forts, imposed governors, and reorganized local economies to extract wealth. The Ming court wanted tribute, trade goods, and acknowledgement. Once those were secured, the fleet sailed home. The difference was not technological, it was political, and ideological. The Ming state possessed the ships and the sailors to dominate the Indian Ocean, but it lacked the motivation to do so. The voyages were expensive, and their benefits were largely symbolic. When political priorities shifted and the costs became harder to justify, the expeditions ended. What the treasure fleet reveals, then, is a world power at the height of its technical and administrative capacity, operating within a cosmology that valued hierarchy over expansion and ritual over conquest. The ships were real, the navigational skill was genuine, and the diplomatic impact was significant. But the voyages were never about opening new worlds or transforming distant societies. They were about affirming an existing order, one in which China stood at the center and all other kingdoms arranged themselves in concentric circles of acknowledgement and deference. That order depended on the willingness of emperors to fund it, eunuchs to manage it, and foreign rulers to participate in its rituals. When any of those conditions faltered, the system faltered with them. The treasure fleet was not the beginning of a Chinese age of exploration. It was the culmination of a particular moment in Ming statecraft, brilliant and unsustainable in equal measure. In the centuries that followed, the story of Zheng He and his fleets became a site of memory, myth, and contested interpretation, reshaped by each generation that rediscovered it. The wooden giants that once crossed the Indian Ocean rotted quietly in the dockyards of Nanjing, their timbers salvaged or left to decay, their voyages remembered only in fragments scattered across 3 continents. Within a generation of Zheng He's death, the imperial court had turned its attention inward, and the records of the treasure fleet became an embarrassment to officials who saw maritime adventure as a costly distraction. Some documents were destroyed deliberately. Others simply mouldered in provincial archives, unread and uncatalogued. What survived was never enough to reconstruct the full story, only enough to suggest its shape and provoke centuries of argument about what had been lost. The scantiest evidence came from the fleet itself. Stone inscriptions at temples and mosques marked the passage of Zheng He and his men, recording prayers offered before departure or thanks given after safe return. One stele, erected in 1431 at a temple in Fujian, listed the countries visited and the distances travelled, though the measurements were vague and the place names sometimes unrecognizable. Another, at a mosque in Malacca, mentioned the admiral by name and noted his faith, a detail the official Ming histories preferred to downplay. These inscriptions were not meant as historical records. They were acts of devotion, scattered across the geography of the voyages like breadcrumbs, offering proof that the fleet had been real but little insight into how it had functioned. The official histories compiled decades later were no more generous. The Mingxi, the standard dynastic history, devoted only a few paragraphs to Zheng He, summarizing the voyages in broad strokes and listing tributaries, without explaining the mechanics of diplomacy or the daily labor that made the expeditions possible. The compilers, writing in the 17th century, worked from sources that had already been thinned by censorship and neglect. They recorded distances, dates, and the names of foreign rulers, but they omitted the costs, the conflicts within the court, and the reasons the voyages had ended. The silence was not accidental. By the time the Mingxi was written, the treasure fleet had come to symbolize eunuch overreach and imperial extravagance, vices the Confucian authors preferred to criticize obliquely or ignore altogether. The most detailed accounts came not from officials but from interpreters who had sailed with the fleet and written their observations for an audience of scholars and curious readers. Ma Huan, a Muslim translator who accompanied several voyages, produced a work called the Yingyai Shenglan, a gazetteer of the foreign lands he had visited. He described the ports, the trade goods, the religions, and the rulers with the careful attention of someone who had actually walked the streets and haggled in the markets. Tai Xin, another interpreter, wrote a similar account, shorter and less detailed, but covering some places Ma Huan had missed. These texts were practical, almost clinical, focused on what a future traveller might need to know, rather than on the grandeur of the fleet itself. They survived because they were useful, not because anyone thought they were historically important. For centuries they circulated in manuscript, copied by hand, read by a handful of scholars, and ignored by the state. For 400 years, the treasure fleet remained a footnote in Chinese historiography, mentioned occasionally but never celebrated. The Qing dynasty, which succeeded the Ming in 1644, had little interest in reviving the memory of a maritime adventure launched by a rival regime. European scholars, encountering references to Zheng He in Jesuit translations of Chinese texts, found the claims implausible and assumed the dimensions of the ships had been exaggerated. The 19th century, with its steamships and colonial navies, made wooden junks seem quaint, and the idea that China had once commanded the largest fleet in the world felt like a nostalgic myth, the sort of thing proud nationalists might invent to compensate for present weakness. The rediscovery began in the early 20th century, driven by Chinese intellectuals searching for historical precedents that might restore national pride. After decades of foreign encroachment, Liang Xichao, a reformist scholar writing in the wake of the Qing collapse, seized on Zheng He as proof that China had once been outward-looking, technologically advanced, and capable of projecting power across vast distances without resorting to conquest. The contrast with European colonialism was deliberate, where the Portuguese and Spanish had arrived in Asia with guns and missionaries, demanding conversion and submission. Zheng He had brought gifts and ritual, asking for acknowledgement rather than obedience. The voyages became a symbol of peaceful exploration, a model of what China might have been if the court had not turned inward and abandoned the sea. This interpretation gained strength as more evidence came to light. Archaeologists working in coastal regions uncovered shipyard ruins, anchor stocks and fragments of hull timbers that suggested the scale of the fleet had not been entirely mythical. Inscriptions were photographed and published. Ma Huan's gazetteer was reprinted and translated. By mid-century, Zheng He had been rehabilitated as a national hero, his image appearing in textbooks, museums and commemorative monuments. The government of the People's Republic, eager to present China as a civilization with a history of international engagement, funded research into the voyages and promoted Zheng He as an ancestor of modern Chinese diplomacy. The treasure fleet, once an embarrassment, became a point of pride. But the pride rested on shaky foundations. No treasure ship had ever been found intact, and the archaeological evidence, while suggestive, could not resolve the central debate over the dimensions reported in the Ming sources. The largest vessels, according to some accounts, measured over 400 feet in length and carried 9 masts, dimensions that would make them the largest wooden ships ever built. Skeptics pointed out that wooden hulls of that size would have been structurally unsound, prone to hogging and flexing in heavy seas, and nearly impossible to maneuver. Defenders argued that Chinese shipbuilding techniques, including watertight bulkheads and internal bracing, might have solved problems that European shipwrights would not master for centuries. The debate remained unresolved because the evidence was incomplete. The ships were gone, and the written descriptions were vague, leaving room for interpretation and wishful thinking. The comparative perspective only deepened the puzzle. When Vasco da Gama rounded the Cape of Good Hope in 1497, his fleet consisted of 4 ships, the largest perhaps 120 feet long, carrying fewer than 200 men. Columbus, 5 years earlier, had crossed the Atlantic with 3 ships even smaller, relying on Italian financing and Iberian determination. The treasure fleet, sailing nearly a century before either voyage, had been larger in every dimension: more ships, more men, more cargo, greater distances and more sophisticated navigation. Yet the European expeditions had led to centuries of colonial expansion, while the Chinese voyages had ended in deliberate obscurity. The contrast posed uncomfortable questions about contingency and choice. If China had continued sending fleets, would European mariners have found the Indian Ocean already dominated by a power they could not challenge? Or would the structural differences between tributary diplomacy and mercantilist conquest have produced different outcomes regardless of timing? The questions extended beyond ships and sailors to the nature of the state that built them. The treasure fleet had been a project of imperial will, funded by the throne, crewed by conscripts, and directed toward symbolic rather than commercial goals. Private merchants had accompanied the voyages, but they operated in the shadows, their activities unrecorded and barely tolerated. The Portuguese and Spanish expeditions, by contrast, were joint ventures between monarchs and investors, driven by the promise of profit and blessed by a church that saw conversion as a divine mandate. The difference was not merely cultural, but institutional. The Ming state could build a fleet larger than anything Europe possessed, but it could not sustain the voyages without the emperor's personal commitment, and when that commitment wavered, the entire enterprise collapsed. European expansion, messy and decentralized, proved more resilient because it did not depend on a single patron or a unified vision. The memory of the treasure fleet, then, carried within it the memory of a path not taken. The voyages had demonstrated that China possessed the technology, the resources and the knowledge to dominate the seas, but they had also revealed the limits of a system that valued ritual over profit and stability over risk. The decision to abandon the ocean was not inevitable, but neither was it accidental. It reflected deeper priorities, shaped by geography, philosophy, and the weight of a bureaucratic tradition that distrusted novelty and rewarded caution. The ships rotted because the state chose to let them rot, and the records were destroyed because preserving them would have required admitting that the choice had been a mistake. What remains is a story told in fragments, inscriptions at mosques, gazetteers by forgotten interpreters, half-remembered speeches by emperors long dead, and the faint outlines of shipyards buried under centuries of silt. The treasure fleet sailed, returned, and vanished, leaving behind just enough evidence to prove it had existed, and just enough silence to ensure that its full meaning would remain forever contested. The questions linger, unresolved, hovering like mist over the Yangtze estuary, where the wooden giants once gathered, waiting for a wind that never came again.